I'm Kristen Allen. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy, and this work is on applying natural language processing methods to identify psychosocial risks among pregnant and recently pregnant people without having to directly ask them about their symptoms. So up to 20% of women experience depression during or right after pregnancy, and about 10% of women are victims of intimate partner violence during this time. But note that these rates may be even higher. So physicians may not screen for these risks because they aren't confident about asking about them, and we know that women may be in a situation where they can't safely disclose anyway. So my work focuses on indirectly detecting these risks so that we have more ways to find out that the problems exist, allowing us to launch interventions when they're appropriate and in a timely manner. So think about a use case where we ask pregnant women to use an app a few times a week to track their moods and journal about their experiences. Can we come up with a way to elicit and detect risks through those interactions? So it's an open question whether natural language elicited in this manner could approximate the results that you get from systematic screening by a healthcare provider. So here's how we begin to answer this question and predict complex and sensitive risks, mostly from language within a small data set. So in box 1, you'll see a preview of the data we collected. It's journal text, a few closed form questions, and the 2 target risk measures. In box 2, we processed the journal text in a couple of different ways to extract language features. We focused on features that were fairly low dimensional and would also be fairly transparent to the end user. So the idea here is that we could predict risk and then hopefully explain to a physician why we thought that particular person was at risk. Then finally, box 3 shows the Lasso regression model we fit to use all these features to predict risk. So the first part of this work focused on how to elicit this sensitive data from real people. We started from Pittsburgh area moms groups on social media, and we used unweighted respondent-driven sampling to get up to around 300 pregnant and newly postpartum respondents. So they were mostly married and mostly white, many with post-secondary degrees, and a little over half were over 30. We first asked journal-style prompts about their day. So how are you feeling? What's impacting your mood? Talk about major interactions or activities and how they're feeling about pregnancy or motherhood. The goal here was to get folks talking about their feelings and the relationships and events that affected those feelings. We then followed up with a few closed form questions that get at the issues we're curious about a little more directly, but still less so than in a standard screening measure. So for instance, mood, sleep quality, relationship conflict. Then we collected the target measures that we want to predict against. For depression, that's the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale. And for partner violence, that's a few questions from the Women's Experience with Battering Scale, which measures psychological aggression. So that's a correlate of physical partner violence. Then we started extracting features from the journal text. So the first kind of NLP we used was topic modeling, which uses our own data to cluster together words that are likely to be thematically related, and outputs a summary of how much each piece of writing relates to each topic. So we used here latent Dirichlet allocation and latent semantic indexing. The next kinds of language features we use are dictionary-based features built on other large data sets. So 2 of them, the opinion lexicon and SentiWordNet, capture information about positive or negative sentiment. And we have Luke, the linguistic inquiry and word count dictionary, where we also see a broad range of thematic coverage, including syntactic dimensions, as well as psychological and thematic categories. So once we have all of these features, we want to down select and figure out just the most relevant ones for a particular risk. So after scaling all of our features, we ran Lasso regression, which penalizes the absolute sum of coefficients with 5-fold cross-validation and 100 loops. So effectively, we used this to find the least complex set of features that made the best predictions we could on a linear model. The method encourages using a smaller number of features, which again helps it to stabilize on a smaller data set and also helps it to be comprehensible from the outside. Then finally, we tested performance of the averaged coefficients on a withheld test set. So what did we find? First, sanity checking our response on the risk measures. We see that our 20% rate of symptoms consistent with depression aligns pretty well with the literature, and our psychological aggression results are also fairly reasonable. So here's just a glimpse of the topic model's output. Looking at topic 40 as an example, we see some coherent themes. Maybe the respondent feels sad because she's been feeling sick and her husband isn't helping her in the mornings. This one is actually interesting. This specific topic correlates positively with respondents experiencing psychological aggression from their partners. So thinking about the sensitive risks that we're trying to predict and just how indirectly we can do that when we're using these somewhat indirect multiple choice questions that you see on the right, we found an area under the ROC curve of around 0.8 on both target measures on our test set. So the most informative question for depression was about mood in the past 24 hours. The most informative one for psychological aggression was this relationship conflict question. So then let's look at the more indirect method using just language features. We found that when looking at depression, the predictive ability from these features approached that of the multiple choice set. So you see that's a 0.71. But then for psychological aggression, the indirect approach with language was much less useful, coming in at 0.56 AUC. So that's just above chance. So these charts show in red the language features that Lasso used most often to predict each risk. And then in black, we have the average coefficient selected for that feature. So for instance, for depression, we see that the opinion lexicon, positive and negative sentiment features were the clear favorites, followed by a few topics, and then the Luke categories for filler words and for assent or agreement terms. So what do we make of this? The first overall finding from this work is that using just language about people's experience, we can predict depression almost as well as when we ask about their mood and other somewhat more direct questions. The second major finding from this work is that language was less informative in detecting intimate partner aggression. This could be because the questions we asked weren't specific enough about wanting to hear about relationships, or it's possible that people in those relationships will always be less likely to disclose in a free-form response. So what did work well here was a question about relationship conflict, which was the primary driver for our high AUC for multiple choice questions on that aggression measure. So people will disclose some relevant information about partner violence, but you can't get it just by asking about how they're doing and reading the response. You have to be more specific in your questioning. So we would guess that in a journal prompt, you probably need to ask specifically about the relationship. Overall, we see that these two psychosocial risks are qualitatively different in how indirectly we can elicit them, but that there are ways to get at both of them without asking point blank whether people are experiencing that risk. We see this as a first step towards finding accurate, indirect alternatives to detecting some of the most troubling risks during and just after pregnancy. And I think I have a minute left for questions.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Kristen. If there's any question, you can raise your hand or type in the chat box.
I still have a quick question. So you said that you're using this journal data to kind of do some, to extract features. So if you want to deploy this in some hospitals or any consulting centers, how are you going to use it without the privacy concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is actually going to be what looks like private healthcare data, right? I think that this is going to require the same kind of protection and privacy measures as other kind of HIPAA data does. One thing that we're talking about is an app that people would use kind of in between doctor's appointments or in between coming to the hospital. So that would kind of provide a supplemental data collection. So, a pregnant woman goes to her doctor once a month, maybe halfway through that month, she starts feeling really depressed. It would be nice to find that out before the next time she goes in.
Great. And another question from the text box from author is, could you motivate why to infer depression rather than directly measure it?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I'll answer the other question you didn't ask first, which is that for partner violence, people often don't want to disclose because it would put them at greater risk to disclose that measure. But for depression, I think that people are probably a little more willing to talk about it. Why not directly measure it? Generally, it's still going to be a little bit difficult for doctors to ask about it. And there's all kinds of like indirect cues they can give off, like not kind of nonverbal cues, like, oh, you're not feeling depressed, are you? They'll do weird things with framing if they're not like in a place to hear it. So I'm not saying all doctors do that, but it's possible that a person is seeing a physician who just like isn't ready to ask that question with like an open ear that day. And so just having a supplemental method is likely to be useful in those cases.